This is The Hollow, a dark fantasy adventure written by Dean Dunakin and narrated by Louis Krahn. Part 2: The Old Road. Chapter 7: Farms. The old road south was kept up by the town for a short distance, but cinders and gravel soon gave way to disrepair and mud pooling in old wheel ruts. Elocant was the end of the line for the trade consortium, and no official merchants took this route anymore. That's not to say it wasn't traveled at all. People still headed into the hollow, and some even headed out, keeping at least a narrow trail from being overgrown. They walked in near silence and hypervigilance for most of the day while the rain tapered off. Old farm fields increasingly turned wild, the route dotted with abandoned houses, sheds, and barns. Trees became more common, casting long shadows as the afternoon wore on. The trail continued, occasionally graveled, usually dirt trending uphill. "Does this road go all the way to Rabadai?" asked Dev. "This one? No, it went to Endo." "I've never heard of that." "That's because at one time, north of Endo, no one had heard of Rabadai. Once they did, Endo was no longer quite as notable, and other routes were faster to Rabidia. But Endo still remained an important seaport." "Then we're headed to Endo?" "We're headed this way. I'm not sure of the exact route." Omega and Dev halted. Aiden was ranging far ahead of the group. "I thought you were guiding us," said Omega. "I said the ways change. You've dipped your toes in the hollow, but did you ever look back the way you came?" Dev and Omega turned to look north. From their vantage on the hill they climbed, they saw their trail winding through the trees, then it quickly blended into a thick deciduous forest that grew all the way to the horizon. Dev called, "Aiden, stop!" Noom could see Aiden in the distance turn back, then stagger slightly, visibly startled. "Noom, what happened to the farms?" "My best guess is they're still there. If we walked back, maybe we'd see them. Or if we waited here until a different time of day." "Does the same thing happen the way we're going?" asked Omega incredulously. "No wonder we got lost so often looking for Elocant. How are we supposed to get anywhere? I can't possibly manipulate the entire landscape to see its true path." Noom said, "Of course you couldn't, but sticking to a road helps. Most of them go back decades if not centuries, so they're stable, more or less." Aiden returned, overhearing the last part. "Then we consider the road, but tomorrow. Time to find shelter. We have our routine, Noom, but what do you recommend?" "There's likely a farmhouse up ahead. We're in an old orchard, it seems." Noom poked an apple with his staff and pointed to regularly spaced trees somewhat off the path near a brook. "I'll adapt to your routine, but we may as well follow that creek up a bit." They picked their way through the roughage alongside the rippling water. Dev led their advance using a large knife that sliced through the brush like paper. Daylight waned, and Noom hoped Aiden would call a halt. He'd gladly look a fool for the sake of a decent camp setup. He jumped when a loud clang ran through the forest. Dev gave a cheer and pulled the weeds back from his find. He had sliced into a wheelbarrow full of heavily rusted tools, pitchforks, scythes, shears. They picked up their pace with renewed energy, and soon found an old wood frame house in a level clearing. The lumber grayed with age, the stone chimney cracked, but all still intact. Aiden gave Noom a friendly slug on the shoulder, then he and Dev started through the grass towards the door. Aiden gave Noom a friendly slug on the shoulder, then he and Dev started through the grass toward the door. "What's it look like?" Noom asked Omega, and made his own visual scan of the area. The knee-high grasses seemed undisturbed. The trees were close around the clearing. Here at dusk, the space between the trunks turned black only a few feet into the forest. Bird sounds blended with the rolling of the brook, and occasional minuscule rustling seemed to indicate only rodents or other wildlife. It's bright, dark, well equal to everything else around here. Sorry, I don't usually have to describe it. They just asked me if it's safe, Omega said, gesturing to the other two. It's safe. Aye. Come on. He touched her arm, and they joined the other two as they crossed the front threshold. Cozy, joked Dev. All the furniture was overturned, broken, and covered in cobwebs. The floor was clear around the cooking fireplace, which looked more recently blackened. Aiden continued on into one of two side rooms, and Noom went into the other. This was a storage room, shelves filled with broken jars and food rotted into dust, fully looted long ago. Even the floorboards were pried up and missing, in search of a hidden cache or used up for firewood. Safe, Aiden called. Empty storage, Noom called back. Returning to the main room, Dev was gone, and Omega was rummaging through his big pack, pulling out the fresh food Cassie had provided. Her face lit up, and she showed off a bag of ground coffee. Hey everyone, Cassie's coffee! Everyone cheered. Cassie's small gesture helped lift their moods, and gave them something to look forward to in the days to come. Dev walked in shortly with some dead wood, then lit up the fireplace a few moments later. He pulled a hatchet off his belt and twirled it. Back in a bit, he said, and walked out. They heard the chopping of wood, and Aiden went to watch from the doorway. Omega started laying out the sleeping gear. Those horsemen in the rain, Aiden said, still surveying the tree line, or of the rain. The nun. He turned to Noom. Were they really there? Could they even hurt us? Noom replied. It was terrifying. The raindrops ricocheting, the sound of that horse screaming. They were there, Omega said, like black holes in reality, outlined in the shape of men and beasts. She looked up. Your attacks didn't damage them. More like... She shook her head, looking for the words. Healed what should have been there. We've seen people and places suffering or causing chaos, but never such a manifestation. Dev returned with a large bale of firewood. This should do, lock her up. Aiden sealed the door and moved onto the windows while Noom set up his own sleeping bag. He grabbed his spear, unlocked the blade, and pulled it off. That's a nice mechanism, said Dev. Noom tossed the blade to him. That's a hallmark of Rubidian spears. Philo helped me balance the strength and convenience of the system. I need to treat the blade from the rain, but light as it is, the spearhead gets heavy by the end of the day. I'll be carrying it in my pack. Noom looked at the blade at the end of his spear. Didn't he just take it off? His spear was wet and his head was sloshed. One or both of those was bad, but to be fair, everything was wet, and they had no warning. His phalanx technically had the day off, but was on a supply run rather than combat. But even so, this deep in disputed territory and in unfamiliar terrain, Noom had never seen such enormous trees, all seemingly covered in thorns and dripping with moss. Halku should not have commanded and opened that cask of reticulum wine. His friend's sense of entitlement at the time seemed daring, exciting, especially for two teenagers that started conscript only 2 months ago. They felt like giants on the edge of the world. However, in 4-hour hindsight, it was clearly a poor choice. He had no more time for excuses. Their phalanx couldn't assemble in the midst of the current onslaught, and in the torchlight he could barely see the attackers. They streamed through the trees wearing face paint that blended them into the forest like ghosts, wielding axes and other short weapons optimal for easy swinging in the close space. The underbrush was crowded, but luckily there was enough room between the huge tree trunks for Noom to at least maneuver his spear up high. He breathed heavily as he wildly knocked away attacks, his head spinning. An axe grazed his arm as though a phantom had run past, then another wounded to his leg. Where was Halku, damn it? Maybe it was better that his friend wasn't close by to witness Noom's demise. Hopefully Halku's wasn't the voice in the dark he heard scream in fear. It was quickly choked off, then just gurgling. He saw bright white eyes in front of him, and he thrust his spear forward. He felt the weight of the man impale on the blade, then was pushed back himself. He stubbornly, and perhaps foolishly, refused to let go of the spear shaft, and fell awkwardly. He landed in the mud, wishing he had a sword. He and the dead man stared at one another on the ground. Noom held his breath, hoping the other man would expand his chest. Surely it would happen any moment. As Noom waited, blood turned the muddy water between them to black. He blinked the bloody water out of his eyes and willed the other man to breathe. Aiden sat down with the rest. Nothing's getting in without serious effort. He looked at Noom. Where are we headed tomorrow? Noom inhaled sharply, blinked again, and took his blade back from Dev. These hills keep building into the Rockies mountains. We'll need to find a way through. Historically, one could sail around from Endo Port, but such an option there is unlikely. There are other routes to try. They prepared dinner over the fireplace, and through the warmth of the fire and camaraderie, the conversation relaxed toward favorite cuisines. Noom was thankful to find such a shelter on his first night in the wilderness. It helped him ease into the abrupt change of his life. They decided on 2-hour watch shifts to keep the embers going. Noom agreed to the second watch, fell asleep quickly, and later traded from Dev, then to Omega without incident. Thank you for listening to this Ember and Sparks production. Click the box on the left to listen to the next chapter or the box on the right to see an overview of all chapters available for this story. Check out the links in the description to listen to this audiobook without interruption. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss a new story. See you soon.